60 Minutes Rewind.
The death of George Floyd in the hands of Minneapolis police came on Memorial Day. 99 years before, that same week, Black Americans suffered a massacre. In the days after World War I, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Greenwood was among the wealthiest Black communities. Oil made Greenwood rich, but jealousy made it suffer. In 1921, a white mob with incendiary rage burned Greenwood to ash. Even memories were murdered when the dead were dropped into unmarked graves. Last December, before the pandemic, we found Tulsa preparing to embrace a reckoning with a plan to exhume the truth and raise the dead.
The community that is Greenwood has thriving businesses, professional offices, doctors, lawyers, dentists.
John W. Franklin speaks of Greenwood in the present tense.
Greenwood is the nexus of that African American community.
Perhaps because he studied Greenwood in 32 years as a historian at the Smithsonian, or likely because Greenwood is personal.
And my grandfather moves here from Rentersville in February 1921. And he's the first person in the family to go to college, Buck Colbert Franklin.
Buck Colbert Franklin was a lawyer who chased his dream to a promised land. Booker T. Washington named Greenwood Negro Wall Street because the district was lined with Black-owned shops, restaurants, 2 newspapers, a 54-room Grand Hotel, a hospital, and the Dreamland Theater, which would soon boast air conditioning. But on the day after Memorial Day, 1921, Buck Franklin awoke to fearful news.
He hears that there's to be possibly a lynching. There's this Black man who's been caught with this white woman in the elevator, and the newspapers are saying, read all about it. There's extra, read all about it.
Tulsa's white newspapers told of a Black teenager who allegedly attacked a white female elevator operator. At the jail, a lynch mob demanded the prisoner. Black veterans of World War I arrived to shield the defendant for his day in court. A shot was fired, and in a running gun battle, the mob chased the Black vets to Greenwood. One of the moments during the riot that your grandfather wrote about was this. On they rushed, whooping to the tops of their voices, firing their guns every step they took. What is it like for you to read those words today?
He too was traumatized by seeing people being shot in front of his eyes. He describes a woman who's trying to find her child who's run in front of her, and she's unafraid of the bullets raining down because her concern is to find her child.
What began as an attempted lynching at the jail erupted into a massacre. From a high grain elevator, a machine gun laid fire on Greenwood Avenue.
Where's the fire department? Where's the police when we need them? We're part of a city. This is not some small town. This is a city of wealth and order and governance. It is now taken over by a mob.
The police joined the mob. National Guard troops pressed the attack against what one Guard officer called the enemy. Quotes from eyewitnesses include, "Old women and men, children, were running and screaming everywhere." A deputy sheriff reported a Black man dragged behind a car. His head was being bashed in, the deputy said, bouncing on the steel rails and bricks. But what happened next may have frightened Buck Franklin even more.
And he hears planes circling and sees roofs of buildings catching fire. And these are from turpentine balls, burning turpentine balls dropped from planes.
The first time in American history, the airplanes were used to terrorize America was not at 9/11, was not at Pearl Harbor. It was right here in the Greenwood district.
Reverend Robert Turner's Vernon AME Church was among at least 5 churches burned along with 1,200 homes. A photo was crudely and imperfectly hand-lettered at the time, running the Negro out of Tulsa.
36 odd square blocks, city blocks, was destroyed. And before they destroyed it, they looted. They took nice furniture, money.
When the black hospital burned, white hospitals refused to take Greenwood's wounded. Those who bled to death included Greenwood's most prominent surgeon. Ultimately, one hospital did make space in its basement for black casualties. The number of dead is estimated between 150 and 300. Survivors included 10,000 now homeless African Americans. 6,000 of them were herded into internment camps and then released weeks later.
I don't know how they did it, but the following Sunday after the massacre, they came and worshiped in our basement. And that's the same basement that we have today.
The murder of a black man at the hands of police is today shouted into the national memory.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
But in 1921, it remained possible to erase a genocide.
I grew up attending segregated Tulsa public schools. Never in any of the schools was anything ever said about it.
The congregation of Vernon AME Church is 2 generations beyond 1921, but they too were victimized.
This was not taught
No.
in the public school.
No,
You never heard about this in
you
class.
never heard a word about it.
When I went to OU in 1998, I was sitting in a class of African American history, and the professor was talking about this place where black people had businesses and had money and had doctors and lawyers, and he said it was in Tulsa. And I raised my hand and said, no, I'm from Tulsa. That's not accurate. And he was talking about this massacre, riot. I said, man, what are you talking about? I said, I went to school on Greenwood. I've never heard of this ever.
How many people were arrested, tried for what happened in Greenwood?
No one.
200 or 300 people murdered, an entire community burned to the ground, and the police were unable to find a single person.
It's a real tragedy.
All the thousands of claims that were filed by African Americans, not a one insurance company paid that claim. And our church was included.
No insurance honored for black Tulsans, no arrests made, no complete count of the dead. The Salvation Army recorded only that it fed 37 gravediggers. The nameless were buried in unmarked graves, while their families were locked down in the internment camps.
I wonder if there are any doubts in this room about whether there are mass graves in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No doubts.
My great-grandmother...
Oral histories passed down generations pointed to at least 4 sites of possible mass graves.
As a mayor, I view it as a homicide investigation.
Phase 1.
G.T. Bynum is Tulsa's Republican mayor. In 2018, he ordered an investigation of all remaining evidence.
What you have is a case of law and civil order being overrun by people who were filled with hatred. We believe at the end of this road we're walking down right now is one of the sites where we found an anomaly.
Anomalies of disturbed earth showed up in the studies of Scott Hammerstedt. That's not a mower. It's ground-penetrating radar.
And right here is the anomaly as we see it.
He's a senior researcher at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey.
The anomalies that we're looking at, what are those?
It's just contrast between the surrounding soil that's undisturbed and then this soil that has been disturbed.
So we're not seeing in these images human remains?
No, it's definitely not like CSI. You don't see individual skeletons, you just see disturbances and contrasts, which is why you can't really say necessarily that for sure it's a common grave, but it's very consistent with one.
Of course, there's any number of things it could be. That's always the thing I have to remind myself.
And there's only one way to find out.
That is exactly right. We have to dig. We have to dig.
But we don't know what's underneath.
A 10-day test excavation is scheduled to begin in July, led by University of Florida forensic anthropologist Phoebe Stubblefield. She'll investigate cause of death, but it's complicated because of the Spanish flu pandemic from the same period.
So just because you find a burial site, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's from the massacre.
Correct. And so I'm interested in markers like signs of violence or any kind of ballistic injuries or chop injuries.
Can you retrieve DNA?
If it's a good preservation state, there's a high probability.
Would it be possible, in your opinion, to actually identify some of these people?
We could try for genealogical matches. So if we had people now who say, oh, I'm missing a relative from that time period, here's my DNA, then we can make matches through similar markers and do the genealogical matches.
The story will continue after this.
There's a long legacy from 1921. Tulsa is still one of the most segregated cities in the country.
Yes.
The north part of Tulsa is black, the south part is white, and the twain don't meet very much.
Right, because of the history of racial disparity that exists in our city. A kid that's growing up in the predominantly African-American part of our city is expected to live 11 years less than a kid that's growing up in a whiter part of the city. By the way, Tulsa is not unique in that regard. You see disparities like that in major cities all around America.
The test excavation is expected to discover whether there are human remains. Next steps would include recovery and the question of how to honor those who have waited nearly 100 years for justice.
How do you commemorate an event that gives dignity and honor to the people who've been lost?
We have taken in recent decades in our memorials to etch the names of every single person who was lost. The 9/11 memorial, the Vietnam memorial. That's not going to be possible here. We don't know the names.
We don't know the names. And you're going to have to do some kind of, we have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So it has to be something that is representative of lost souls, lost in anonymity. Something like that will have to be planned.